Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Gone Phishing, Service Continuity After a Cyber Attack, which is sponsored by Scholarly Network Security Initiative. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. First off, all of the attendees who are joining the presentation today are automatically muted and your cameras are disabled, so please don't worry about generating noise or feedback. We have that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. And we're using the Q&A feature today. If you have questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to drop them into that Q&A box. And at the end, we'll take some time to answer as many as we can get to. But often we have more questions than we do have time to get to. So we apologize in advance if we are not able to get to your question in the presentation itself. Also note that there is closed captioning available for today's session. If you would like to toggle that on or off, you can use the little CC button in the bottom right corner of your screen to turn that on or off. If you're active on Twitter, we'd also encourage you to use the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars to live tweet the program. Also note that we are recording the presentation today, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. So with that, we are ready to get started, and I will turn things over to Gwen.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for this presentation. I'd also like to thank our global attendees. I'm very excited that we were able to offer Spanish language translation for this. This presentation is sponsored by the Scholarly Network Security Initiative, or SNSI, and the presentation is on cybercrime and the threat it poses to libraries and their users. I'm Gwen Evans, and I'm the Vice President of Global Library Relations at Elsevier, and I have the pleasure of representing SNSI in this session. We're a relatively new organization, and we were set up to bring together publishers, libraries, and institutions to increase awareness of the cyber challenges threatening the integrity of the scholarly record, scholarly systems, and the safety of personal data. Cybersecurity threats have become increasingly common both in and outside the research enterprise, and it's something to which the education sector is unfortunately particularly vulnerable. For example, the National Cybersecurity Center in the UK places the education sector as the third largest target for attacks, ahead of retail. This is due to the fact that most universities routinely store a tremendous amount of personal data. Not long ago, the City of London Police issued a statement specifically warning universities of a threat posed by the paper sharing site Sci-Hub. Sci-Hub obtains academic papers through a variety of duplicitous means, such as the use of phishing emails to trick university staff and students into divulging their login credentials. Given this threat, London police went so far as to advise IT departments to block the website in order to mitigate the security risk to the institutions and their students, faculty, and staff. Manchester University and University College London, amongst them, have done this, as well as other universities. In 2019, the Washington Post reported on the US Justice Department's investigation into Sci-Hub, which includes both criminal and national security implications, as the question is whether Sci-Hub is tied to Russian military intelligence. Weak defenses on campuses can and do invite attacks, and many IT organizations are instituting regular security audits that may disrupt service or end in a ban on particular core applications that libraries depend on. There are some complex and vexing issues around securing library and other systems. Transparency, confidentiality, and privacy concerns are balanced with the IT infrastructure's need to protect campus and personal data. Service disabling attacks can come from very sophisticated sources, In my previous role as the executive director of the State Library Agency OhioLink, I once got a call from the governor's CIO asking why one of our on-premise library-specific software servers was trying to call North Korea. On the other hand, service disabling events involving a variety of cybercrime can also be on a much smaller scale. As the head of library IT in one university I worked for, an embezzlement arrest resulted in significant disruption as the fraud involved eBay. Servers, hard drives, and applications were disabled or seized until the investigation was concluded. Library operations are now so woven into other digital and network services on campus that attacks or breaches can have profound effects on all library operations and personnel. Publishers and librarians have successfully worked together before, for example, on Crossref, seamlessaccess.org, and most recently GetFTR. We believe such collaboration can reap benefits here too. The first step is awareness of the issues and the very real implications for libraries and our users. These problems can't be solved in isolation. It requires collaboration among service and data providers, librarians, and the IT organizations on campus. To this end, SNSI is proud to sponsor this panel of librarians who will give their personal and institutional experiences with cybersecurity related attacks. And now I'll hand it over to Melissa DeWitt to start us off.
Thank you so much, Gwen. And I do want to start off by introducing myself. My name is Melissa DeWitt. I'm a research and instruction librarian at Regis University, and I am going to moderate our panel today. I do want to start by thanking ACRL Choice for hosting our webinar and giving us this space to talk about what we consider to be an important and really relevant issue to each of us. A huge thank you to Gwen and SNSI for sponsoring this event and giving us the space to tell our stories. And then also shout out to Lisa for finding us. We had proposed this elsewhere and were rejected. So finding this space for us and putting this together, we're very excited to be here today and to share our stories with all of you. So just a quick overview before we get into each of our questions today. Our panelists will each introduce themselves in a moment. The way that this will work is I'm going to ask 4 questions about their cybersecurity experience. They will have a few minutes to respond, and we'll also do a Q&A at the end. So if you do have questions, feel free to use the Q&A box or hold on to them at the end of the session so we can answer them. And without further ado, I will take us to our panel and our questions. So for our first question, I'm going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves and then take us through the cybersecurity event or the cyber attack that they experienced that they're here to speak about today. So to start with, Erin, could you please introduce yourself and talk about the cyber event?
Certainly. Hello, everyone. My name is Erin McCaffrey. I'm Dean of the Library and Director of the Center for Student Success at Regis University, which is located in Denver, Colorado. I have oversight for the library, the Learning Commons, and our Student Disability Services and University Testing departments. Regis University was cyber attacked in the early hours of August 22nd, 2019. All of our technology systems were brought down as a precautionary measure. So that included phones, email, our website, all online programs. And we were not able to use any university-owned computer hardware for quite some time. The attack occurred as our summer courses were coming to an end, and it was also move-in day where residential students were returning to campus. So it was a busy time leading up to the start of our fall terms. As a result of the cyber attack, our summer courses were extended for a week. Classes for our residential students started on August 26th as planned, with our residential Wi-Fi network being restored a few days later. And then our online courses and our accelerated term courses were delayed by about a week. So our online learning management system was restored on September 1st, and then those classes began on September 3rd. The university also relatively quickly established an alternate website that they could use to start to communicate information out to the university community. At the time of the cyber attack, we had approximately 100 applications or services that were regularly being used across the university, with almost 200 servers in our data center that were supporting those. So all of that was brought down when the cyber attack occurred. About 5 months after the attack, we learned that it was indeed a ransomware attack, and the university did pay the hackers. There's no evidence that our data was compromised in the attack, and there were federal and third-party investigators that were involved. They were unable to determine the root cause, but we know that it originated outside of the United States. And one thing that I will be curious in hearing from our other panelists as well, for us at Regis, they attacked our backups first. So our institutional continuity plans that were already in place were based on having those backups. And since those were compromised in the attack, it resulted in our IT department making the decision to rebuild and update systems. So our recovery was quite long because we had to take that approach. And I'll speak more to those after effects as we continue through the panel today.
Thank you, Erin. That sufficiently stressed me out all over again. So thank you for taking us through that. I am excited to hear from Ramel next. Please introduce yourself and take us through your experience.
Sure. My name is Ramel Spinell. I am the Web Services and Instruction Librarian at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. Just to give you context, Stevens is a science and engineering school. It has a population of 3,791 undergrads, about 3,500 grads, and probably around 330 faculty and about 620 staff members. So our cyber attack happened around August 8th, and a lot of these things are going to be kind of similar in the proximity of when these attacks happen in the academic calendar year and stuff, especially how they happened around this time. So our attack happened in August 8th, August 8th of 2019. Where approximately 75 campus members encountered a ransom message upon logging into the Stevens network. So subsequently, IT shut down everything to contain the attack, and then made plans with campus partners to get back up. The library was really involved in the triage unit, as our technical infrastructure is really important to the students, especially as they got back to school. Our immediate and my job in all this was really to communicate out to our students, because this was about 3 weeks right before classes were about to start, we usually start around August 29th. And so we were trying as desperately as possible to get some of our technical infrastructure back, because everything was shut down. You couldn't print, you couldn't scan, you couldn't use computers on campus and so forth. So we were just bare boning it until we got clearance that some of our technology was back. The school was able to get back online Wi-Fi by the time the start of school, but there were so many things that just needed to get back into place, mostly of hardware issues, because as I mentioned, with all those students and faculty and staff members, every computer had to be taken offline, scanned, and made sure that there wasn't viruses on it. So that took a long time, and we were still feeling the effects of it up until the beginning of the pandemic, which was great. Why not jump from one crisis to the next crisis? So that's basically where we were, and we were still. I'll get a little bit more into the details with our next question. Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting to hear how many similarities there were between those two experiences. I'm going to transition to Christina, our last panelist, and I intentionally had you go last because you have a little bit of a different experience, but I think is really important to share for folks who are at this webinar today. So could you also introduce yourself and then take us through the event that you experienced?
Sure. So, hi everyone. I'm Christina Vela-Bisbee. I'm the Journalism and Government Information Librarian at Columbia. In this position, I serve the social sciences and specifically the Department of Political Science. And for the purpose of this talk, the really important part of my job is that I am a main coordinator of electronic resources in my subject area, which, as I mentioned, is political science. So in 2019, so May 2019, hackers attempted to gain access to and alter military intelligence that was provided to Columbia by the libraries. They did this by impersonating a Columbia student and using the library's various channels for research support to gain access. So in other words, the very channels that we use to make ourselves accessible to our users, virtual reference, email reference, web forms, our reliance on these channels are what made us vulnerable to this attack. So this database was also prominently featured in our library guides and our publicly indexed website. So I can't say which database this is, but it's not your typical library vendor. It's an industry database. It's very useful for faculty who are experts in international affairs and political science, but it's probably not very useful for your typical undergrad who's thinking about majoring in poli-sci. But if your library serves a law school or a law firm, a business school, a hospital, or a medical school, this is something that could happen to you if you're providing specialized resources. So in 2019, the libraries learned that someone claiming to be a Columbia student was trying to access this database by contacting our vendor directly. So they were essentially saying, hello, I'm a student. I am trying to get access to your resources. Can you please help me? In a CC'd email between myself, the vendor, and the student, it was disclosed that I was the primary contact for relations between this database and the university. In a separate email thread between just myself and the vendor, they told me that they believed this hacker was spoofing the university's IP address. So for those of you who don't know what spoofing is, it's the process of imitating somebody's IP address in order to gain access to otherwise inaccessible content. It's what libraries will often use to verify someone's affiliation. And it's what we're pretty sure that that's how hackers sort of gained access to the email account, which was then used to offer legitimacy to this person's request. So first, they emailed me directly. And as I sort of ignored their requests, they then began to email other librarians at our institution and drop my name to give sort of like leverage to the requests that they were making. So I have a few links here to some screenshots of some of the different interactions that we had with this person. I'm going to go ahead and drop them into the chat. Let me know if you can't see them or there's problems with accessing those, and I can make sure that they are uploaded as a part of some of the resources for this panel. So you can see here in this image, they're calling me out specifically as somebody who they've spoken with, who should provide them with access. And I had seen sort of my fair share of trolls and hackers, but this was on a very different level. The way that these communications would go, they would identify themselves as an affiliate. They would then send a copy of their fake student ID as proof of who they are. They would drop my name, and then they would make this request for information. So I also have an image here of a fairly convincing spoofed user ID, which they used. It's not completely accurate, and a lot of the parts of our ID card have since changed. But the kinds of requests we were getting were things like high resolution images of aircraft carriers or maps of military bases. In several instances, there were requests that we actually reach out to the vendor to change or alter information in this database. So for example, technical specifications for drones and surveillance devices being used in the Middle East. The main thing that sort of changed between these sort of general asks and something very specific is that once they got the attention of somebody who was sort of live and willing to talk to them, they were then willing to sort of get very specific about what they needed and became very urgent about these requirements. So I also have a link here to give you sort of an example of what it is that they were looking at. Looking for. So again, I want to reiterate here that academics, they're not the primary users of this database. It's defense contractors and security intelligence firms. However, this resource was really a feather in the library's hat. This was our way of showing that we are legitimate to our users, that we have a lot of leverage in our ability to sort of give our users what they need in order to do good scholarship. And it was also something that we had been using for a very long time without any issue. So this was something that kind of blindsided us. So I want to sort of sum it up. These hackers had a combination of institutional knowledge and technical skills at their disposal. We received about 20 individual referrals from the same user, and those came through a variety of channels. So they were emailing individual librarians, they were emailing different campus librarians, of which we have libraries, excuse me, of which we have about 20 different locations on campus. They were filling out online reference help forms. At one point on an email thread, I was on this email thread with the student and 3 other campus librarians. Most chilling to me was actually their usage of our chat reference. So they were speaking to a librarian in real time and troubleshooting access. Because our library system is so decentralized, some of these attempts came pretty close to a security breach, especially when the hacker was speaking with students or staff who don't normally work with patrons in this area and therefore may not have recognized the threat. So as I mentioned, we had about 20 different referrals from the same user through a variety of channels over the course of 2 weeks. So it was a very sort of abbreviated and intense amount of time in which they were sort of testing all of our defenses and seeing if they could get in. As I was sort of fielding inquiries from admin and librarians and our IT staff, things got quiet for a month after we started ignoring them. And then things picked back up as we started the fall semester, at which point we canceled our subscription. And I can talk a little bit more about that later on in the panel.
Thank you, Christina. It strikes me how elaborate all of that became over time in the ways that they attempted to get access to this information. So now that we have a little bit of context for what happened and sort of what the situation was for each of us, I am curious about what came next, really, if anything. So if you could speak to the immediate impacts and the long-term repercussions on services and your institution's operations. And you might also consider, while thinking about this question, too, ways you tried to provide services despite all of this chaos and disruption as well. So we're going to change the order up just slightly, and I'm going to ask Ramel to take the first question.
Okay, so so like I mentioned before, all our systems are shut down. And so like we said, like there was no Wi-Fi, there was no hardware, there was no, basically no software. The only things that we were able to work on were things that we basically had outsourced or the university had outsourced. So like our website wasn't down because we had outsourced, our server to a third-party provider. So that's a good thing because then you're able to communicate with your campus, what's going on and what's getting back online. So, but everything had to be shut down. Everything from our public computers, our scanners, our printers, our Wi-Fi network, for a long, while we were coming into work, while the hack was going on in IT and the administration was trying to figure out, was trying to figure out how to bring things back up to date, we were basically working off our phones Wi-Fi, and to connect our computers, whoever had a cleared computer, because basically at this point, the university was starting to collect computers, everyone's computers, to have them scanned and cleared, which was a really slow and arduous process. And everybody has different computers, they have PCs, they have Macs, and so forth. So so everything, including interlibrary loan. I'm going to share a link to kind of our communications page that we had running up on our library site, and you can kind of see, if you start at the bottom, that's the earliest update we had, which started around August 16th. You can see that where we communicate to everyone that access to library services and resources like the research databases, interlibrary loan, the library catalog, everything is unavailable. And then some delays. By August 26th, we start to establish database access again, just because we were able to reconnect to our easy proxy, so that people could get into databases and our catalogs. You can see that, duckbills, which is kind of like the way that students pay for things on campus, was reestablished. ILL came back and so forth. But at this time, we're still trying to figure out how to get students access to be able to like print or scan, or even to use some computers in the library. So by August 29th, I think we start, book checkout is starting to come back. We're starting to get our circulation desks, workstation working. Some computers are back, but not any. We're starting to refer people to public, the Hoboken Public Library, which is a library that's really close by. And then around September 25th, basically a month and a half, almost 2 months, we finally get printing available on campus, but just to 2 computers. So basically we set up a printing station for 2 computers to be able to print. Luckily at a STEM school, most people don't print papers as much as other schools, but they still need them because we have job fairs and stuff, and people have to print resumes and so forth. So printing is really still important. As we get into December 2nd, and we went through a whole October, November without any kind of updates, until we were really starting to get everything back up to date. And December 4th, we're almost back up to normal, just because we're able to get back a lot of our computers and so forth. So as you can see it by the timelines, we started in August and we're going into December. And just to let you know that a lot of our personal computers were taken away, and like we're being scanned. There's a process order that's being put into place. Like for the library, the director and myself had to get back our computers immediately so that we can be able to distribute information to the rest of the campus and about the library and stuff. So let's see. And so the only things that were really up and running for us were, of course, the things that were run on third parties, like our library website, LibGuides, LibAnswers. So we were able to still chat from our website. One thing that was difficult to deal with too at that time is that we still had to come into work and kind of like do things without computers and Wi-Fi and the things that we take for granted that we're working on every single day. So we had to find other projects to do. So if we needed to make new signs and stuff like that, we had to make new signs and so forth. So it does become a very complicated matter when you're trying to figure out these things and you're kind of in the dark of where things up. It's not like things turn on automatically. It's like slowly things are coming back on, maybe like similar to like a blackout. And just to make a note again about the timeline is that even going into January 2020, a couple of our library staff members hadn't gotten their computers back. And actually, one thing that we realized is that over the last couple of years before the attack, our IT department had gone through a large restructuring. And so many people who used to be there weren't there. And so the systems administration was really unclear. And so sometimes we had computers, like my computer in my office. I had a PC also, which had an administrative password. No one knew that password. And so we couldn't even get into certain computers. So remember, write down your administrative passwords, because IT might not have it, especially if they've gone through a large turnover of people in their department. So these are all things that we were trying to do at the same time, provide the services like research, instruction, database, electronic services to everyone. That's it.
Thank you. And this isn't going to be a strong enough word, but that sounds challenging, to put it very, very lightly, to work through that environment, which I think we'll talk about a little more in our next question too, on how that felt. I am going to ask Christina the same question. What were the immediate impacts and, if any, long-term repercussions on services and your institution's operations? You already briefly mentioned you canceled the database.
Yeah, so the ultimate repercussion is that we ended up canceling our subscription. We were able to find a comparable resource with an academic vendor that we had a longstanding relationship with. The resource isn't like as hot as the one that we canceled. And this isn't necessarily the ideal outcome, but because the threat was so coordinated and it was so relentless, and it gave me like creepy crawly feelings. We're going to talk about that in the other question. But it was very clear to me that this sort of like response or attack was going to continue to happen in some form or fashion. And we simply did not have the infrastructure in place to counter that kind of attack. Immediate impacts. I got to speak with a lot of staff I don't normally talk to on a normal day, so that was really nice. There were conversations sort of like up the chain across the system with both IT departments inside and outside the library. And so there was sort of like a coordinated response, the best that we could sort of in the moment. It included access staff, IT staff, our collections department, and we had sort of the same sort of unified response, which is do not engage. If we can't stop these people from reaching out to us, then we simply need to keep them at bay by not feeding the trolls, as they say. At one point, I sent out an all staff email to the library, everyone in the library, which was not ideal, but I was getting emails from everyone across the library system, people I had never met, who were saying that they were receiving these requests and that my name had been dropped, and they just wanted to know if I had spoken to this person. And so, yeah, I had to sort of be the person who would take action, because there was also a lot of sort of like throwing the ball from like one person or one department to the next. So because it had to do with the university's ID system, the registrar and like CUIT were kind of involved. Because it had to do with the database that the library subscribed to, our collections folks were involved. And nobody was really willing to take responsibility for making sort of a change in access. It's also important to note that the students that were being impersonated, because it was more than one, it was multiple students that they were impersonating, they were current affiliates at the university. They were not like made up students with made up identities. These were people who were actively enrolled or staff members at our institution. And so it created just a very sticky and difficult situation for us. And there were no sort of clear directions about where we were supposed to go from there. I also contacted the FBI and let them know I have not heard back from them. If anybody is listening, I'm available if you would like to chat.
Thank you, Christina. Sounds messy. And yeah, if anyone has contacts to look into it, shout out. And then we'll round off this question with Erin. Same question for you.
Thank you. So I think some of our experience mirrors a little bit what Ramel described, but we also have some differences as well. The immediate impacts, really the first few days were just filled with a lot of confusion and shock and lack of clarity about what was actually going on until it was confirmed that it was a cyber attack. We had to go analog on many things. So, it was the start of our semester. A lot of us had sessions that had been scheduled. We had to find ways to connect with those faculty to see if and how we were going to try to do this without knowing, the state of our e-resources at that point in time. So there was a lot of just walking across campus, hoping to bump into someone, slipping notes under office doors, trying to find colleagues on social media and message them that way, just kind of any way we could think of to connect with other people. And at the institutional level, everything initially was focused on our students and being able to start classes and getting our physical and virtual classrooms running. So that was good, but then it was extremely challenging that we had no access to our online library resources as the semester was kicking off. And even though the learning management system was brought back online relatively quickly, none of the links within the LMS to other university systems were functioning. So any library database links or ebook links, our electronic reserve system, none of those links were functioning because all that access was still unavailable. So it was about a week after the cyber attack that our IT department began the process of starting to scan all the university-owned computers. So that was the initial step to the eventual restoration of faculty and staff computers. Macs were restored relatively quickly. Anyone with a PC, those were under quarantine for much longer. So our first post went up on our library blog with links to alternative open access resources about a week or 10 days after the cyber attack, as we knew, okay, things are going to be disrupted here for a while. So all of our librarians got to work developing lists of other information resources that, at least since classes were underway, we had students with assignments, we needed to direct them somewhere since our authentication was still down, so we couldn't access the majority of our licensed databases. And many of our systems, as Ramel described also, were externally hosted, but because quite a few of them had custom domain mapping to appear as if they were part of the campus domain, they remained inaccessible to us. So once we got to about mid-September, the Office 365 environment was made available to us. So we were able to set up a SharePoint site to provide alternative access to databases. So myself and some of our other librarians started reaching out to vendors, trying to determine what workarounds they might be able to provide for us to ensure that our faculty and staff could access those resources. So that worked as a workaround, but because of how that had to be configured, we had to approve every request for access. So Melissa and myself and many of our other colleagues were, very rapidly monitoring those requests and improving them as they were coming in. We set up Gmail accounts to use as an alternative way to contact the library in the interim until we had access back to our university email system. And then printing was a real issue. And I'm sorry, I know this is a pain point for Melissa and myself and any of our Regis colleagues that might be in attendance today. So Printing was restored in kind of a temporary fashion. So it required students to have their document on a flash drive that they would then literally plug into the printer. And the document had to be a PDF. And we had a lot of challenges with students who just, had really no idea what a flash drive even was, on top of compatibility issues and such. So there was a period of time where our research help desk in particular was really just a printing support desk. So that was frustrating for staff and faculty in the library. It was frustrating for students, and we just did our best to help them meet their needs at that point in time. We also faced some facility disruptions when the cyber attack occurred. So all of the security cameras in the library were down. So the first few weeks after the cyber attack, we had faculty and staff on shifts at one of our entrances, just our accessible entrance, to ensure that if someone needed to get into building, they could. There's also a phone at that entrance. Of course, the phones were down. So eventually we created a Google phone number where they could call for access, and we didn't have to have someone sitting at the door. Not a library service interruption necessarily, but the student food pantry, the campus student food pantry, is located within our library building. And the cyber attack just coincidentally also aligned with our remodeled cafeteria opening, and meal plan options had changed. So we had a lot of students that were a little caught off guard at the changes to the meal plans and were wanting to have access to our student food pantry to get food. So we also, in that first kind of 2-week window when things were still pretty disrupted and we were all here on campus but unsure what to do, we had library staff and faculty that were also sitting there and helping out our colleagues that run the food pantry to ensure that students had access there. It was not until mid-October that probably about half of the faculty and staff computers had been scanned and restored, and probably about half of the classroom and lab computers were restored by that point. In terms of other library service disruptions, it wasn't until March of 2020. So again, our cyber attack happened late August 2019. It was not until March of 2020 that our interlibrary loan system was restored. And then around that same time was when restoration began for our e-reserve system. And then that was further delayed and disrupted because of the pandemic and campus closing. And then the IT staff that had been working with us on that had to shift their time to ensuring that faculty and staff had what they needed to work remotely. So it wasn't until the summer of 2020 that we had full access back to our e-reserve system. So the recovery was a long process because our institution chose to rebuild, but then having the pandemic come into play and added on to that, it made some things take even longer to be restored.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, panel. We've been through it. And so that kind of brings us to our next question. And then just for panelist folks, we have about 15 minutes until we are looking at the end with about 2 more questions. So keep that in mind too. But I do want to touch on this. I'm very interested in your response to this question because we have our theme of service continuity, and services don't happen without people. And the labor and the work that goes into providing those services. And what you're describing is a really stressful, really challenging work environment. And so thinking about that, can you describe the emotional impact on you, maybe you personally, other employees at your institution, either during or following the events? And we have a little change in the order again. I'm going to have Christina go first with this one.
Yeah, and I'll try to keep things brief. So there were sort of like 3 feelings that came up to mind for me. One is awe, Next was like feelings of sort of like embarrassment or like face threatening vibes. And then sort of frustrations around visibility. So this was sort of the first. I've been working in libraries since 2015, but this was sort of the first moment in this current position that I'm in where I really felt like my actions and the choices that I made were going to have consequences that were larger than the institution that I was serving and the users that I was working with. It really sort of reinforced in me the power of information that we provide, especially at sort of these larger institutions. It really does more than just reinforce the education cycle of knowledge that we're a part of in our own little bubbles. They really do have real world impacts. So that was the first thing that came to mind. I also felt really responsible because my name was being invoked in a lot of these calls. I somehow felt responsible, which is really weird, right? Because it's not like I did anything to sort of spur these attacks, but because I was being called upon in that way, it was pretty face threatening. And then finally, there was frustration around visibility, right? People were concerned, but I was really concerned. It was my name that they were using. Like, we need to nip this in the bud now. And the process of which it took for us to cancel, which included, taking statistics about usage and polling faculty and talking with students about, what would be an acceptable alternative. All of those things sort of took time, and I don't think that it was addressed with the same kind of urgency that I thought should have been, should or could have been done.
Thank you. Definitely understandable emotions. I am sorry you felt that way throughout that whole process. I'm going to turn it over to Erin next for the same question.
There were a lot of, in terms of emotional impacts, feelings of frustration, just not being able, I think mostly stemming from not being able to serve our students in the way and in the quality and manner in which we typically would and are known for doing. So all of the library employees really went above and beyond to try to provide that continuity to students, but it was definitely very frustrating. At the time of the cyber attack, I was about 4 months into serving as our interim dean. So personally, I really focused on disseminating information and communicating as much as I could to the library staff and faculty, and then taking their questions and concerns up to our provost. Our provost held initially daily updates. She would come together at noon every day in our cafeteria to share information with faculty and staff across academic affairs, and then she would collect questions and concerns and take them back to our CIO. As time went on, then those went from daily updates to twice a week to then weekly, but I appreciate her efforts to ensure there were some communication channels, because again, initially the emphasis was on anything that was, student facing, so that courses could start in the fall as planned. But as time went on, we're all basically competing for time and attention from our university IT department for our other systems or lingering issues. So I also felt like I was spending a lot of time advocating for our needs, but that was good as well because it created more awareness across the university of some of our services and just the impact on our students and our faculty when they're not available. And, also there's no easy in just thinking about connecting with family or friends outside of this and trying to talk about this experience. I mean, there's really no easy way to kind of succinctly explain what you're going through. I remember being at a barbecue and trying to talk to a friend just about like the scale of what we were dealing with, and it was immense. And when you really think about, okay, I have no phone at work, I have no computer, I have, all those things that we rely on so much. on a day-to-day basis. And there was also real frustration at having to use personal devices for as long as we did. We had employees that reached the limits on personal data plans in those first 2 weeks or so after the attack. You know, a lot of us we brought in our own personal computers, but they were old and slow to run. And so eventually we purchased some Chromebooks in the library that we made sure every department had access to, so at least we could use those in the interim once wireless access had been restored on campus, but before we all had our university computers back. So it was an exhausting time for sure, but I'm very proud of how we all came together and supported each other during that window, and then, you know, again, continued to serve our students to the best of our ability.
Thank you, Erin. Your barbecue story resonates with me deeply. It felt like all I was talking about in my spare time and no one got it. Ramel, could you talk us through emotional impacts from your situation as well?
Sure. I think I have the stages of a campus-wide cyber attack. So one, there's shock. A shock in that an attack can shut down normal, everyday, mundane operations, even like calling someone up on the phone in their office. Everything came to a halt, and it's just that shock that you hear about cyber attacks and you don't know kind of the little harm that it could do besides the bigger harms. Second, the uncertainty. Questions like, when will things get back to normal? Are the powers that be resolving the issue? How can we have been better protected by this? When are our own systems going to get back so that we can give the service back to the students, so that they could, so that they can be successful at what they're doing. Third is like frustrations and sometimes anger. Why haven't they resolved this? What were their emergency plans in case of an attack? Why doesn't IT have an administrative password to my computer I can't get into? Why can't IT find my computer? Because actually, there was a computer that was lost in kind of like the chaos that existed during this thing. And lastly, there's still uncertainty, right? That resonates for a very long time. I think it still resonates. Is like, how can we be ready for the next attack? Will we be ready? And just to make a note, like I said before in the beginning, is that we didn't really even get a chance to reflect upon how we can recover or how we can proceed forward after a malware attack, so that we can have systems in place so that if this happens again, we can protect ourselves a little bit more, just because the pandemic followed it right afterwards. Although I have to say that having this malware attack prepared us for the pandemic, which is kind of a weird connectedness of these crises, conjoining crises. So yeah, it's all those emotions that we were going through, because we just want to help our students and our faculty, and and everything's being held down by technology, and how it can be held back by a cyber attack like this.
Thank you. I took notes on the 4 stages of cyber attack, and I really appreciate like the even more uncertainty, and even right for me, and maybe for some of us, the fear that it'll just happen again, and are we going to be ready, or is it going to be this again? So I appreciate you sharing those insights too. And we are on to our 4th and final question for the panel, and one that I'm sure that folks in the audience are really curious about. We have the benefit of hindsight, right? And maybe haven't had a ton of time to reflect, but we do know some things now. What do you all think libraries or institutions such as our universities can have in place in the event that they experience a cyber attack? Maybe thinking about what would have been helpful for us had we had that in place. And so I will start with Erin.
So our library had a disaster plan in place prior to the cyber attack, which was primarily focused on concerns related to physical collections and physical space. We did have an appendix focused on technology, so some information for which systems had servers on campus and some vendor contact information, but really not anything on the scale of what we needed then once we had been through the cyber attack. So we are collecting information and trying to update that plan to reflect both lessons learned from the cyber attack and then the pandemic as well. We also had, things like a backup of our A to Z database list that had the proxy URLs in it, but because our campus authentication was rebuilt, those proxy URLs weren't working because the authentication had to be rebuilt. So that's why we ended up doing that direct vendor outreach to try to create alternate access for a period of time until authentication was restored. The majority of the hardware in the library is managed by our university IT department and part of that overall campus technology infrastructure. So I know I would like more clarity going forward, just what is our institutional continuity plan for the, when we might face this again, so that we can ensure that we're prepared for that side of it too. And then just on more of the people, the human element here, make sure that you have, a communication chain established for emergencies. I just began by, texting our leadership team and then asking them to pass those messages on via text to the folks in their departments. And then eventually we were able to expand other methods of communication. But in that first week, it was just really, anything we could use to communicate with each other, we did, just to make sure folks were informed as to what was going on. But like Ramel said too, I know personally in preparing for this panel today, it's really given me the space to kind of step back a little bit and do a little more reflection on what we actually went through, and hope this summer that we can document more of that for whenever we likely will find ourselves, probably in something hopefully not on this scale in the future, but the attacks continue, so we need to be prepared.
Thank you, Erin. Fingers crossed we get a little respite before another crisis. Hopefully there just isn't another one, but let's go to Ramel for some thoughts.
Yeah, I'll get to technological recommendations. I think cyber attacks are going to continue happening, especially at universities. I think there was an article just recently in Inside Higher Ed about how universities are just prime targets for cyber attacks, just because they contain so much personal information, and they're such big organizations and have infrastructures that could be vulnerable to these attacks, and that ransomware attacks are becoming higher, and even in the ransoms are starting to double, even from say 2018. But as these crises build up, I think it's important that libraries, start reflecting upon, especially coming out of the pandemic, of what crisis and what we want to guarantee and what our values are, so that we know what we want to guarantee to our students and our faculty and to our community. Because right now I'm reading The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. And so a way to take out, to be opportunists is, as we've seen in historical instances just recently, is that, say in Katrina, you see the total wiping away of a city, and then you get rid of the education system and you replace it with privatization. And sometimes those, what's being new and innovative isn't in the best interest for our communities. So that's what we have to be really careful of, as well as, building these infrastructures that are going to protect us, like having a backup Wi-Fi, or having, what Erin proposed with, a backup easy proxy systems, so that we can always keep these things online. And also setting up a good communication structure. I think we were actually lucky that we have at Stevens, we have a good communication between all the departments on social media, especially Instagram. So we were always kind of communicating with our students through there, because you really don't have access to a lot technology. You know, you can't really call anybody. And like Erin said about text messaging, one of the first things that we did was collect everybody's phone numbers, you know, because we never got in touch with people on their personal devices or phones. So those are things that, you know, could always be helpful for this. But, you know, knowing who we are and what our community needs is really important, and not to get lost in, you know, like, hey, let's build something new now, you know, and that new might not be the best thing for our communities.
Thank you. I think you had some really great suggestions. And then I hear both of you mentioning, right, communication as this really important aspect throughout as well. And then finally, Christina, any final thoughts on what this could look like for other folks?
So I'll keep it short and sweet. Number one, protect your IP range. Don't publish that on your website. Just tell it to the people who need to know. Number two, plan for the next attack, not just the one that you've already had. So these attacks are just going to get more sophisticated. Work with your partners on campus who are already thinking about these things. There are experts that are there and available and would probably love to talk and have a voice in that conversation at your institution. And then finally, this one is sort of specific to mine. Take responsibility for the content in your collections. I think a lot of times we are so focused on providing access, we don't really think about what the impact is of what's actually in those collections. And ultimately, if we cannot account for the risk associated with that material, I think a larger question should be had about whether the libraries is the appropriate place to be providing that content. So just ending on a real happy note there.
Thank you. All of this has been incredibly uplifting. So, but really informational. This has been great because I want to say thank you to everyone on this panel today for sharing your stories and for processing this information and talking about the impact and educating others who may or may not have had these experiences as well. I think this is so important. So I really appreciate that you all were here today. I am going to turn this over to Lisa for some final remarks. I know we're at time, so if folks are able to hang out for just a few minutes, we would love to kind of close out and also maybe address one or two questions. And with that, I will have Lisa take it over.
Great. Thank you, Melissa, for doing such a great job moderating. And if you wouldn't mind putting on the next slide right now as well. I think there's been a few questions, but actually as I've been monitoring them, I think they've actually been answered for the most part as you've kind of gone through the progression. So since we are at time, I think we'll just turn to mentioning that there will be some follow-on opportunities sponsored by SNSI, particularly looking at, okay, now that maybe we've realized that maybe we didn't realize before the kind of thing that could happen to us. I know I feel really stressed out now and I didn't even go through this myself. So we should stress test this, library service continuity plans for cybersecurity events. And so some upcoming opportunities to think about this more in a hands-on way. I want to also mention that we will be making this recording available, as well as a number of people have mentioned that the transcript would be really helpful. We're going to read that over just to correct anything before we post that as well. I want to also thank our translator who has made this content accessible to the Spanish-speaking attendees. Thank you so much to Choice for arranging this wonderful technology and platform and registration system, to our almost 300 attendees who were with us here today, and to SNSI for sponsoring this session. I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you.